Today we are going to be looking at the area of vitiating factors and more particularly the areas of duress, undue influence and unconscionability, also referred to as exploitation of weakness. As we have seen, in order for X and Y to enter into an agreement, it is necessary that there be a meeting of the minds, i.e. that they agree to the same thing. This meeting of the minds is thought not to occur where there is what is referred to as an inequality of bargaining power between the parties. For example, where they are acting under duress, undue influence, or where there is an exploitation of weakness, unconscionability. Let's first look at the area of duress. Not surprisingly, if Y agrees to enter into a contract with X because X is holding a gun to his head, the courts are of the opinion that there has not been a true meeting of the minds. This is called duress and is defined as coercion, either physical or mental, administered by one party that deprives the other party of his free will. In the UK, contracts entered into under duress are voidable, and thus the party claiming duress must inform the other party that he is repudiating the contract. Interestingly, the fact that there has been duress involved in the negotiation of the contract is not sufficient proof that there has been no meeting of the minds. It is necessary for the party so claiming to demonstrate that the duress administered was the actual cause of the decision to enter the contract. Let's look at the case of Barton and Armstrong. In this case, Y held a gun to X's head and made him sign a contract. X, not surprisingly, sought to repudiate the contract on grounds that he had entered into the agreement under duress. Y argued that although he had held a gun to X's head, X had signed a contract not because of the gun, but because economic circumstances dictated that he do so. On a majority decision, the court accepted X's claim even though he may in any event have signed a contract without the use of duress. According to the court, to demonstrate duress, it is necessary to not just show proof of a threat, but to demonstrate that the threat influenced the victim's judgment. The court did agree that the onus was on the coercing party to demonstrate that the threat did not influence the decision of the other party. The duress does not have to be violent or physical. The courts have recognized other kinds of duress. For example, the threat of criminal prosecution. However, as the area of criminal prosecution is one normally carried out by public authorities, the threat to instigate criminal proceedings against another is considered duress and will work to invalidate a contract where it is shown to have influenced the decision of the other party to enter the contract. Let's look at the case of Williams and Bailey. Williams, X, threatened Bailey, Y, that he would prosecute Y's son for forgery if Y did not meet promissory notes on which the son had forged Y's signature. Y agreed to pay X the money, but later repudiated the agreement. X sued for payment, and Y claimed that he'd only entered into the agreement to pay under duress, namely the threat by X to prosecute his son. In the opinion of the court, the threat to initiate criminal proceedings against Y's son amounted to duress, and so Y had the right to repudiate the agreement or contract with X, whereby he promised to pay X the amount of money owed to him by his son. It appears, however, that the threat of civil prosecution will only be considered as duress where the threat is spurious or without foundation. Thus, a threat to bring an action to recover a debt is not considered as falling within the heading of duress. Another form of duress is the threat of economic loss. If X contracts with Y to build a factory and halfway into the building of the factory, X requests that Y pay him an extra 10% for the building work, threatening to delay the work if payment is not forthcoming, such a contract will be regarded as being entered into under duress, and consequently, X can repudiate the agreement to pay an extra 10% to Y. Now let's look at the area of undue influence. Undue influence is said to occur when one party in a close relationship with another takes advantage of that person by reason of their being in a superior position. Where this occurs, the weaker party has the right to repudiate the contract he has entered into with the stronger party. Cases under the heading of undue influence can be broken up into different categories. The first, where the relationship between the parties is such as to give a presumption of undue influence, i.e., where the parties are in a special or fiduciary relationship. And the second, where the parties are not in a special relationship, but where undue influence has nonetheless been exercised. So let's first look at where the parties are in a special fiduciary relationship. Where the parties are in a fiduciary relationship, there is a presumption of undue influence, whereby the stronger party must prove that the weaker party did not enter the contract as a result of undue influence. To do this, the stronger party must show that the other party entered the transaction with a full understanding of the nature of the agreement and by a completely free exercise of his or her own free will. Fiduciary relationships are said to arise in cases of a parent and child, lawyer and client, religious advisor and believer, investment advisor and client, and trustee-beneficiary relationships. A husband and wife are not considered to be in a fiduciary relationship, and neither is a bank and its client when the bank is providing normal retail financial services to the client. Now let's look at a situation where the parties are not in a special fiduciary relationship. In cases where the parties are not in a special fiduciary relationship, the burden of proof falls on the alleged victim of the undue influence to establish that the other party was in a dominant position and that undue influence was used. Let's look at the case of Lloyds Bank and Bundy. In this case, Bundy, Y, was an elderly farmer who for a number of years had relied on his bank manager of Lloyds Bank, X, to take care of his financial dealings. It was in the context of this relationship that X convinced Y to mortgage his house to the bank so as to act as guarantor for his son's debts to Lloyds Bank. At the time, the son's business was in a very bad financial condition, and in the circumstances, no person in their right mind would have given their house over as security. In time, Y's son's business failed, and the bank sought to take possession of Y's house as satisfaction for his son's debts. Y contested the action by the bank, claiming that the bank manager, who convinced him to give his house as guarantee against his son's debts, was in a dominant position to him and had used undue influence in convincing him to enter into the agreement. The court held that normally the relationship between a bank and its clients does not give rise to a fiduciary relationship where the bank is providing normal banking services. However, on the facts of the present case, the court held that there was a relationship between the parties that robbed Y of his free will when entering into the agreement, and thus there was a case of undue influence. The best defense to a claim of undue influence is for the alleged dominant party to insist that the other party take independent advice. Once this has occurred, the weaker party can no longer claim undue influence. Now let's look at the area of unconscionability or exploitation of weakness. In certain limited circumstances, the courts are willing to accept that a person is not bound by their contractual obligations where there was an excessive inequality with respect to their bargaining positions at the time the agreement was entered into. This exception flies directly in the face of the laissez-faire economic system the courts were anxious to promote in the last century. However, such a defense exists where the circumstances are particularly unfair. The application of this doctrine frequently occurs in the area of consumer contracts. For example, adhesion contracts, so-called take it or leave it contracts, or standard form contracts. It is necessary, if you wish to rely on this defence, to show that one of the parties was in a greatly superior position to the other, and that he or she exploited this position by imposing unusually severe terms on the other party. The terms imposed have to be shocking in their extremity and nearly offensive if the defence is going to work. Factors that the courts will take into account when making a finding of unconscionability include whether there was an alternative choice available on the market, whether one of the parties had superior knowledge, whether the transaction was unusually complex or required special technical knowledge. We hope you enjoyed this introduction to the areas of duress, undue influence, and unconscionability.